The first time my mother called me in 15 years, she didn't ask how I was. She asked if I was free for lunch. That should have been my warning. I was 32, sitting in a hospital break room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and antiseptic wipes, still wearing scrubs with my name stitched over the pocket. My phone buzzed across the table like it didn't recognize me anymore. When I saw her name, I stared at it long enough to notice my hand had gone completely still. "Hello?" I said finally. Her voice slid through the speaker, warm, practiced, almost relieved. "There you are! I was beginning to worry I had the wrong number." Worry. From the woman who left me behind with a duffel bag and a note taped crookedly to the fridge. She talked as if we'd spoken last week, as if she hadn't vanished from my life at 14, as if the years between had been a minor inconvenience instead of a long, quiet erasure. "We're so proud of you," she said too quickly. "Your name has been everywhere lately." That was the second warning. By the end of that call, she had mentioned family, forgiveness, starting fresh. She never once mentioned the man who raised me when she didn't want to. The uncle who skipped meals so I could eat. The uncle who never called himself my savior, only my responsibility. 2 days later, my father emailed. 3 days after that, my sister sent flowers to my office. Expensive ones. The kind that arrive with a card written in someone else's handwriting. Everyone wanted to see me. No one wanted to see him. And standing there, holding that vase like it might explode, I realized something unsettling. They hadn't come back because they missed me. They came back because they finally needed me. I don't remember my parents leaving in a dramatic way. No screaming, no slammed doors, no last-minute speeches about hard choices and brighter futures. What I remember is the sound of the zipper. It was early morning, still dark outside. I was 14, sitting on my bed with my school uniform folded neatly beside me, listening to my mother close a suitcase in the hallway. I assumed we were late for something. That assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for her to hand me a duffel bag I'd never seen before. "Your uncle will be here soon," she said. That was the entire explanation. No timeline, no return date, no apology. My father stood behind her, already wearing his jacket, keys in hand, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder like I was furniture he didn't want to trip over on the way out. My sister was already in the car. She didn't look back. I didn't cry, not because I was brave, because I didn't understand yet what was happening. It wasn't until the car pulled away that it settled into my chest, heavy, irreversible. They weren't stepping out to cool off. They weren't testing me. They were done. My uncle arrived 20 minutes later, breathless, hair still damp from the shower, holding a grocery bag in one hand, like he'd grabbed the first thing he could find to bring a child he hadn't planned on raising. He looked at the empty driveway, then at me. That was the moment he realized he was all I had. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call them. He didn't sit me down and promise things he couldn't guarantee. He just said, "You hungry?" and started making eggs like the house belonged to both of us. It didn't, not really. His apartment was small, 1 bedroom. The couch sagged in the middle like it had given up on posture years ago. The heat worked when it felt like it. The fridge hummed louder than most conversations. But he cleared space for me without making a production out of it. I slept on the couch for 6 months. He pretended it was temporary. We both knew it wasn't. Money was tight in ways people don't romanticize. The kind where you learn which meals can be skipped without anyone noticing. The kind where "we'll see" actually means no. He worked 2 jobs, one during the day, one overnight. Sometimes he came home so tired he forgot to eat the dinner he'd packed for himself. He never forgot to pack mine. He didn't talk about sacrifice. He talked about logistics, bills, schedules, school forms he didn't understand but signed anyway. He attended parent-teacher meetings wearing the same jacket every time, nodding politely, asking questions he'd written down beforehand so he wouldn't forget. When teachers asked where my parents were, he said, "Unavailable," and didn't elaborate. That word did a lot of work. I learned quickly not to ask for things that cost money. When I did, I followed it with a justification. I don't really need it. It's fine if it's used. Once, when he bought me a calculator for a math class, I cried in the bathroom because it felt excessive. He knocked on the door and said, "If you break that thing, I'm blaming the math, not you." That was his version of comfort. Years passed, slowly, uneventfully. The kind of years that don't make good stories but make stable people. I studied, I worked, I earned scholarships. I learned how to be efficient with everything: time, money, emotion. My parents didn't call, not once. When I got into college, I mailed them a letter. No response. When I graduated, I didn't bother. By the time I became a doctor, I had stopped thinking of them as missing. They were just absent, like a room you don't use anymore. You know it's there, but it doesn't factor into your daily life. My uncle aged faster than I did. His hair thinned, his hands stiffened. He waved off doctor visits with jokes about being allergic to waiting rooms. When I insisted, he said, "Fine, but if they give me a gown, I'm walking out." That was his idea of rebellion. I moved out eventually, but I never moved away. I checked in every day, brought groceries, fixed what I could. He never asked for help, which meant I learned to offer it in ways that didn't bruise his pride. And then, just when my life finally felt settled, the people who left decided they wanted a seat at the table. They didn't come back with regret. They came back with smiles. And that was how I knew, before any document, before any conversation went wrong, that whatever they wanted from me now, it wasn't forgiveness. It was access. The first lunch was harmless enough. At least, that's what I told myself afterward. My mother chose the restaurant. Of course she did. Somewhere quiet, expensive, the kind of place where the menus didn't list prices and the waitstaff addressed you like you might own them someday. When I arrived, she stood up too quickly, knocking her chair back as if we were in a movie and this was the emotional reunion scene. She hugged me like she was checking a box. "You look incredible," she said, pulling back just far enough to scan me. "So confident, so put together." I smiled, because that's what you do when someone compliments the version of you they never helped build. My father arrived a few minutes later, all polished manners and professional warmth, shaking my hand instead of hugging me. That should have been another warning. Parents who reach for handshakes are usually negotiating something. The conversation stayed on safe ground at first. My job, the hospital, how demanding my schedule must be, how proud they were. Pride came easily now. It hadn't cost them anything to earn. Then the questions shifted. "So," my father said casually, folding his napkin, "are you affiliated directly with the hospital, or are you operating through a private foundation?" I paused. "Both," I said. "Why?" He waved a hand. "Just curious. You know how these things work." My mother leaned in. "And your name is on the programs, right? The initiatives you're part of?" I nodded slowly. "Yes," she smiled. "A little too wide." "That's wonderful. Visibility is so important." Visibility. There it was. The word Aaron had warned me about. They asked about boards, about donors, about how decisions were made, whether I signed off personally or if there was a legal buffer. Every question was phrased like interest, but none of them were about me. Not my health, not my life. Not the man who had raised me when they chose not to. Aaron's name didn't come up once. By the end of the meal, I felt like I'd just completed an interview I hadn't applied for. When the check arrived, my father reached for it quickly, almost theatrically. "Please," he said, "let us." I let him. It felt fair somehow, to let them pay for one thing. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. People reconnect awkwardly. Parents don't always know how to bridge lost time. Maybe they were just clumsy. Aaron didn't comment when I told him about lunch. He just listened, nodding occasionally, his eyes focused on the chipped edge of the kitchen table. "They didn't ask about you," I said finally. "No," he replied. "They wouldn't." That annoyed me, more than it should have. "You don't know that," I said. He looked up then, not defensive, not smug, just tired. "I know patterns," he said. "People ask about what they plan to touch." I didn't respond. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of being right. Over the next few weeks, the contact increased. Texts, calls, invitations. My sister reached out, suddenly nostalgic, sending photos from childhood I barely remembered being in. She joked about how serious I'd always been, how responsible. Like those traits had been charming quirks instead of survival skills. They started referring to my work as our family's achievement. That was new. One afternoon, my mother called while I was between patients. "We were thinking," she said, voice syrupy, "about how nice it would be to collaborate." "Collaborate on what?" I asked. "Oh, nothing specific yet," she said quickly. "Just ideas. Philanthropy, investments. It would look wonderful to have the family involved." Involved. Another word doing heavy lifting. Later that evening, I found Aaron in the kitchen, reading the same newspaper article for the third time. "They want me to help them with something," I said. He folded the paper carefully. "Help or lend?" "What's the difference?" I asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Help means they share the risk. Lend means you carry it." I laughed, a little too sharply. "You've been watching too much late-night finance television." "Occupational hazard," he said dryly. "When you work security, you hear a lot of people confess things they think don't matter." That was Aaron's humor. Quiet, observational, occasionally inconvenient. The next meeting made the shift impossible to ignore. My parents brought documents. Not contracts, nothing that obvious, but outlines, proposals, draft ideas that all seemed to orbit one central fact. My name was valuable, clean, trusted, marketable. They talked about leverage, about credibility, about smoothing things over. "Nothing for you to worry about," my father said, tapping a page. "We'd handle the heavy lifting." That phrase again, heavy lifting, as if I hadn't been doing it my entire life. I asked what would happen if something went wrong. My mother's smile didn't falter. "Why would it?" That was the moment something inside me went cold. Because people who have nothing to lose always ask that question. I left early, claiming work. In the car, my hands shook, not from fear but from recognition. I had seen this before. Not in boardrooms, but in smaller ways. In the way they decided I was expendable when I was inconvenient. In the way they were deciding I was essential now that I wasn't. At home, Aaron was fixing a cabinet hinge that didn't really need fixing. "They want something," I said. He didn't look up. "I know." "And you think they'll take it if I don't stop them?" He tightened the screw, then finally met my eyes. "I think they'll take it whether you stop them or not," he said calmly. "The question is how much you're willing to lose before you say no." I didn't answer him then. I wasn't ready. But that night, lying awake, I asked myself something I couldn't shake. If you were in my place at that moment, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have fought back, even knowing what it might cost? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Because deep down I already knew. Silence had never protected me before. And this time, it was going to cost more than feelings. If my uncle had told me outright, "Your family is trying to use you," I might have pushed back harder. Not because he would have been wrong, but because saying it plainly would have made him sound bitter. And Aaron never allowed himself that luxury. He believed bitterness was a shortcut people took when they didn't want to think clearly. Instead, he warned me the way careful people do, indirectly, quietly, with questions that sat in your mind longer than statements ever could. A few days after my parents brought up collaboration, Aaron asked me what seemed like a random question while we were eating dinner. "Who signs your name when you're not around?" he said, twirling his fork through pasta. "What?" I asked. "In your organization," he clarified. "If you're in surgery, who has authority?" I shrugged. "Legal team? Why?" He nodded like he'd just confirmed something for himself. "Good," he said. "That means your name stays where it belongs." I didn't press him. I should have. Instead, I told myself he was projecting, that years of scraping by had made him overly cautious, that not everyone who smiled at you was trying to take something. I wanted to believe my parents were just awkward, clumsy with reconciliation, that they were circling my life because they didn't know how to enter it properly. That belief lasted exactly until my sister invited me to coffee. She chose a place near her office, bright, loud, full of people who looked busy enough to overhear nothing. She arrived late, kissed my cheek, and launched into conversation without pausing for breath. "You've really built something impressive," she said. "It's inspiring." That word again, inspiring. Everyone loved that word when they weren't the ones doing the work. She asked about my schedule, my stress levels, how I managed burnout. Questions that sounded personal, but landed strangely close to logistics. She asked how often I traveled, whether my job required international appearances. Then she leaned back, crossed her arms, and said, "You know, with everything you have going on, it would make sense to let family handle some of the less glamorous parts." "What parts?" I asked. She smiled. "Administrative, oversight, protection." Protection. That one made my stomach tighten. "From what?" I asked. "From risk," she said smoothly. "From being taken advantage of." I almost laughed. Almost. The irony was impressive. "I have people for that," I said. "Of course you do," she replied quickly. "But family is different." There it was, the pivot point. The moment when love was offered as leverage. I didn't commit to anything. I didn't refuse either. I went home and told Aaron about the conversation, half expecting him to finally say what he'd been circling for weeks. He didn't. Instead, he asked, "Did she bring paperwork?" "Yes." "Did she explain why you were necessary instead of helpful?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If they could do this without you," he said, "they would. People don't invite complications unless they need cover." I snapped at him then. I hated myself for it later. "You don't know them," I said sharply. "You only see them as people who hurt me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. "That's true," he said. "But I also see people who hurt themselves when they're desperate, and desperate people don't slow down." The conversation ended there, but the tension didn't. Over the next few weeks, the requests became more specific. My parents stopped using vague language and started referencing timelines, opportunities, urgency. They talked about how time-sensitive everything was, how lucky it was that I was available now. When I asked why everything had to move so quickly, my father said, "Because momentum matters." Aaron overheard that line on speakerphone and muttered, "So does gravity. Ask anyone who fell." That made me laugh despite myself. He had a way of cutting through nonsense with one sentence, like popping a balloon without announcing it. Still, I resisted seeing what was forming in front of me. Part of it was guilt, the kind that sneaks up on you when you're doing better than the people who made you. Part of it was fear. Saying no felt like reopening a door I'd spent years sealing shut. And part of it was habit. I had spent most of my life being the one who adjusted, the one who made things easier, the one who absorbed inconvenience so others wouldn't have to. That habit doesn't disappear just because you succeed. One evening, after a particularly tense call with my parents, I found Aaron sitting at the table, carefully sorting mail. He paused when he saw my face. "They're asking for something you can't give," he said quietly. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because if you give it," he replied, "you won't recognize your life afterward." I stared at him. "You're assuming the worst." He nodded. "I am. That's my job." "That's not fair." "No," he agreed, "but it's practical." I wanted to argue. I wanted him to be wrong. Instead, I did something worse. I dismissed him. I told myself he was scared of losing me, that he saw threats where there were only misunderstandings, that he didn't understand the world I was in now, the scale, the complexity, the way influence worked. I didn't realize yet that he understood it better than I ever would. Because Aaron didn't need to sit in boardrooms to recognize exploitation. He had lived it. And while I was busy trying to believe my family had finally chosen me, he was watching them measure how much they could take. The mistake wasn't that I ignored his warning. The mistake was that I assumed there would be another one. The first time they said it out loud, they wrapped it in compliments. My father invited me to his office, the kind of place designed to make you feel smaller the moment you step inside. High ceilings, heavy desks, framed photos of men shaking hands with other men who all looked equally pleased with themselves. He gestured for me to sit, then spent a full 5 minutes talking about how impressive my career was, how disciplined I must be, how proud he felt watching me rise. I let him finish. Then he slid a thin folder across the desk. "We've been working on something," he said, "and we realized your involvement could make all the difference." There it was. Finally. Not family, not healing, not reconciliation. Involvement. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were clean pages, professionally printed, full of language that sounded reassuring without actually explaining anything. Strategic partnerships, public-facing leadership, temporary representation. "You'd be the face," he continued. "Not the operations, just the public trust side." I looked up. "Why me?" He smiled as if the answer were obvious. "Because people believe you." That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. People believed me because I had never given them a reason not to. Because my reputation wasn't built on favors or shortcuts. Because I had spent years doing the unglamorous work quietly, consistently, without cutting corners. And now that trust was being treated like a resource to be extracted. My mother joined us halfway through the meeting, carrying coffee like she was hosting a talk show. She placed a cup in front of me and rested her hand briefly on my shoulder. "You've always been the responsible one," she said. "This is just an extension of that." Responsible. Another word with a sharp edge. They explained their situation carefully, not in full detail, never in full detail, but enough for me to understand the outline. Their business had hit a wall. Regulatory issues, investor hesitation, a credibility problem they believed my name could solve. "We're not asking you to risk anything," my father said quickly, anticipating my objection. "Legally speaking." Legally speaking. The phrase lawyers use when they don't want to promise safety, only defensibility. I asked questions, precise ones. What authority would I have? What liability would I carry? What happens if something goes wrong? My sister answered most of them, sliding in smoothly like she'd rehearsed. "Minimal," she said. "Contained. You'd be insulated." I'd heard that word before. In medicine. Usually right before something ruptured. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. The room went quiet for just a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be dramatic. Long enough to be telling. My mother recovered first. "Why would you?" That wasn't an answer. I told them I needed time. They agreed too quickly. On the drive home, I replayed the meeting in my head, dissecting every phrase. They hadn't asked me to build anything. They hadn't asked for my expertise. They hadn't even asked for my time. They wanted my credibility. When I told Aaron about the meeting, he didn't interrupt. He listened the way he always did, elbows on the table, hands folded, eyes steady. "They don't want you involved," he said when I finished. "They want you exposed." "That's not fair," I replied automatically, though the words felt thin in my mouth. "Fair has nothing to do with it," he said. "It's math." He reached for a pen and pulled a scrap of paper toward him. "If something goes right," he continued, "they get what they want. If something goes wrong, who does it land on?" I stared at the paper. "They said it wouldn't," I said weakly. Aaron snorted before he could stop himself. "Of course they did. Nobody invites you onto a sinking ship by announcing the leak." That was one of his better lines. I almost smiled. Almost. I wanted him to be wrong. I needed him to be wrong. Because if he wasn't, then everything my parents had said about wanting to reconnect, about regret and growth, was just staging. That night I read through the documents again, slowly, carefully. This time without listening for reassurance. This time listening for gaps. And there were gaps. The kind you could drive a lawsuit through. Clauses that shifted responsibility without naming it. Language that implied authority without granting it. Pages that referenced attachments that didn't exist. This wasn't collaboration. It was cover. The next morning my father called to ask if I'd had time to think. "I'm still reviewing," I said. "Good," he replied. "We're on a bit of a clock." That was when I understood the urgency. Not momentum. Not opportunity. Desperation. For the first time since they came back into my life, I didn't feel flattered or conflicted. I felt clear. They hadn't returned because they loved me. They had returned because they believed I was useful, and more importantly, controllable. What they didn't realize was that the girl they left behind learned something they never did. When people only see you as a solution, they never consider what happens when you stop cooperating. And I was very close to doing exactly that. I didn't confront them right away. That wasn't strategy. That was instinct. Years in medicine teach you one thing very quickly. You don't announce a diagnosis before you've reviewed the labs. You don't accuse before you understand the mechanism of damage. And you definitely don't operate before you know where the bleeding is coming from. So instead of arguing, I did something far more dangerous to them. I read. Every page, every footnote, every reference to another document that would be provided upon request. I requested them, politely, casually, like a daughter trying to be helpful. They sent most of what I asked for, not all. That omission told me more than the documents themselves. The structure was elegant in the way traps often are. On the surface, my role was ceremonial, advisory, symbolic, reassuring. Underneath, my name threaded through everything that mattered. Accounts, public disclosures, external communications. In several cases, my signature would be the last one on the page. If the project succeeded, they'd claim vision. If it failed, I'd own the credibility loss. I started mapping it out on my dining table, paper spread like a puzzle someone had intentionally left pieces out of. I highlighted phrases, cross-referenced timelines, looked up shell entities they assumed I wouldn't recognize. I recognized them. One afternoon, while I was on the phone with a colleague, I casually mentioned a company name from one of the documents. There was a pause on the other end. "Why are you asking about them?" she said. "I'm not," I replied. "Just curious." Another pause, longer this time. "They've been flagged," she said carefully. "Nothing public yet." That was my first external confirmation. The second came from a friend in compliance who owed me a favor. I didn't give names. I didn't need to. I described the structure, the flow, the way responsibility was being distributed without being acknowledged. She sighed. That's not insulation, she said. That's a lightning rod. When I got home, Aaron was sitting at the kitchen table, repairing a watch that hadn't worked in years. He looked up as I dropped my bag. They sent more documents, I said. He nodded. They would. They left things out. Of course they did. I sat across from him, rubbing my temples. They're not stupid. No, he agreed. They just assume you'll prioritize peace over precision. I exhaled slowly. They assume I want them back. He didn't respond immediately. He focused on the watch, carefully tightening a screw that didn't need tightening. They might be right, he said finally. Wanting people back doesn't make you weak. No, I said, but letting them set the terms does. That night I found the email. It wasn't sent to me. That was the mistake. It was buried in a forwarded chain my sister had attached without checking. The tone was different, sharper, less affectionate. No mention of family or reconciliation, just objectives. They discussed my public trust rating. They debated whether my hospital affiliation was strong enough to counteract their recent losses. One line stood out, written by my father. If she hesitates, we'll remind her what we've done for her. I stared at that sentence for a long time. What they'd done for me. Not raised me, not fed me, not stayed. Left me. Aaron read it over my shoulder. He didn't swear, he didn't slam the table. He just nodded once, like something had finally aligned. There it is, he said quietly. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not sadness. Permission. Permission to stop doubting myself. Permission to stop trying to translate manipulation into misunderstanding. Permission to accept that some people don't return because they regret leaving. They return because they think enough time has passed for you to forget why they left in the first place. I replied to my parents the next morning. I told them I was open to continuing the conversation, that I just needed a bit more transparency, a clearer picture of the risks. They were thrilled. My mother called immediately, her voice light and relieved. I knew you'd come around, she said. You've always been sensible. Sensible. I nearly laughed. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't coming around. I was stepping back far enough to see the entire shape of what they were trying to do. And once you see the whole structure, the only real question left is this. Do you walk away quietly? Or do you make sure it can never be rebuilt the same way again? I hadn't decided yet, but I was very close. The strange thing about realizing someone is trying to use you is that it doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with clarity. Once I saw the structure of what my family was building around my name, I couldn't unsee it. Every conversation afterward felt like watching a play when you already know the ending. The lines were the same, the smiles were rehearsed, even the pauses felt timed. I didn't confront them. Instead, I listened. When my mother called, I let her talk longer than usual. When my father emailed, I asked follow-up questions that sounded cooperative but required detailed answers. When my sister texted, I responded slowly, politely, never committing to anything concrete. They mistook my calm for compliance. That was their second mistake. The first had been assuming I was still the same girl they left behind, the one who adapted, absorbed, adjusted. The one who learned early that survival meant not making things harder for other people. They hadn't accounted for what that girl became. Aaron noticed the shift immediately. You're quieter, he said one night as we ate dinner. That's either very good or very bad. Why? I asked. Because when people stop arguing, he replied, it usually means they're either done or they're documenting. I smiled despite myself. I'm not building a case. He raised an eyebrow. You're just noticing patterns? Exactly. He nodded approvingly. Patterns have a way of testifying on their own. Over the next 2 weeks, the requests escalated. They wanted me to attend meetings just to observe. They asked me to be copied on emails for transparency. They suggested I meet with their advisors so everyone feels aligned. Aligned was their favorite word. Alignment, I learned, was what people called obedience when they wanted it to sound collaborative. At one meeting, my father introduced me as the moral center of the operation. I almost choked on my water. Another time, my sister joked that having me involved was like putting a doctor's coat on the whole thing. That way, she added with a laugh, everyone assumes it's clean. She meant it as humor. So did I, just not in the same way. After each interaction, I wrote things down. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just notes, dates, phrases, who said what and in what order. I wasn't planning anything yet. I was just making sure my memory stayed sharper than their revisionism. Aaron watched this process with a kind of quiet approval. He didn't ask what I planned to do. He didn't offer strategies. He just made sure I ate, made sure I slept, made sure I didn't convince myself that discomfort meant I was doing something wrong. One evening, as I was organizing files on my laptop, he glanced at the screen. "Careful," he said mildly. "You're starting to look like someone who knows the ending." "I don't," I replied. "You know enough," he said. "That's usually worse." The turning point came during a call I hadn't expected. My father wanted to discuss contingencies. That word again, always the words that sound reasonable. He spoke carefully, outlining hypothetical scenarios where public scrutiny might increase, where questions might be asked, where narratives would need to be managed. "And your presence," he said, "would help stabilize perception." "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning people trust you," he replied, "and trust is transferable." I didn't argue. I didn't object. I asked him to clarify. "So, if something goes wrong," I said slowly, "and my name is attached, what happens to me?" There was a pause, longer than before. "Well," he said finally, "that's why we're being careful." That was the answer. Not reassurance, not protection. Deflection. After the call, I sat in my car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. I thought about the way he'd said my name, confidently, comfortably, as if it already belonged to him again. When I got home, Aaron was watching a rerun of a cooking show neither of us followed. "They're getting sloppier," I said. "That happens," he replied, eyes still on the screen, "when people think they're close to winning." "I think they assume I'll cave," I said. "That guilt will do the work for them." He muted the TV and looked at me. "They're counting on the version of you that needed them," he said, "not the one that outgrew them." I exhaled slowly. "What if I'm wrong?" He shrugged. "Then you lose a few awkward dinners and a lot of bad faith. That's survivable." "And if I'm right?" "Then you stop something before it costs you your name." That night I reviewed everything again, not with fear but with distance. I stopped asking whether my parents meant well. That question had become irrelevant. Intent didn't matter. Impact did. And the impact of what they were asking, of what they were positioning me for, was clear. If this collapsed, I wouldn't just lose credibility. I'd lose the one thing I'd built entirely on my own: my integrity. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do next. Not confront them, not cut them off. Not yet. I needed them to keep talking, because the only thing more revealing than what people plan to do is what they're willing to admit when they think you're already on their side. By the time I agreed to move forward, I knew exactly what that phrase meant to them. It didn't mean partnership. It didn't mean trust. It meant momentum, their momentum, finally dragging me along with it. I said yes carefully, not enthusiastically, not reluctantly either, just enough to sound cooperative without sounding eager. That balance mattered. People who are manipulating you don't want passion, they want predictability. The meetings increased. So did the contradictions. At first, they were small. A timeline that shifted by a week. A figure that changed depending on who was explaining it. My sister would say one thing, my father another, and my mother would smooth over the discrepancy with a smile that suggested details were unimportant. Details are never unimportant. They're just inconvenient. I started asking the same question in different ways, to different people, on different days. The answers didn't line up. One afternoon, my father told me the funding was already secured. 2 days later, my sister asked whether my involvement could help reassure potential backers. My mother insisted they were doing this out of principle, then casually mentioned the reputational damage they'd suffer if it didn't go through. Principle, apparently, had a price tag. I didn't correct them. I wrote it down. The more comfortable they became, the less careful they were. They began assuming I understood their shorthand, that I shared their priorities, that I wouldn't object to the framing because I'd already accepted the premise. That was when the real story started to slip. During a planning call, one of their advisors referenced a previous issue I'd never been told about. He corrected himself quickly, but not before my father waved it off. "She doesn't need the full history," he said. "We're past that." Past it. Not resolved, not cleared, just buried. After the call, I asked for clarification. "Oh, that," my sister said lightly. "It was nothing, just noise." "Noise usually leaves a paper trail," I replied. She smiled. "You worry too much." That was rich, coming from someone whose entire job revolved around managing risk. I started noticing something else, too, the way they spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening. Once, when I arrived early to a meeting, I overheard my mother in the hallway. "She'll do it," she said confidently. "She's always been reasonable." Reasonable. The word they used when they meant pliable. Another time, my sister joked that having me involved was like insurance without the premiums. I laughed along. Timing matters when you're gathering information. Correcting people too soon just teaches them how to lie better. At home, Aaron watched all of this unfold with the patience of someone who had waited his entire life for other people to catch up. "You're not angry," he observed one night as I organized notes on my laptop. "No," I said. "I'm disappointed." He nodded. "That's worse for them." "How so?" "Anger makes people reckless," he said. "Disappointment makes them irrelevant." That was Aaron's philosophy in a nutshell. Don't burn bridges. Let them collapse under their own weight. There were moments, quiet ones, when I questioned myself. Wondered if I was reading too much into things. If maybe this really was just clumsy reconnection, wrapped in bad business instincts. Then came the meeting that ended that doubt completely. It was supposed to be informal, just family and a few advisors. No agenda, no pressure. That was what they said. Halfway through, my father mentioned a contingency plan. "If regulators get involved," he said casually, "we'd want to emphasize your leadership role." I looked up. "Why my leadership?" "Well," he replied smoothly, "you're the public-facing element." "And if there are consequences?" I asked. He hesitated, just a fraction. "We'd manage that together," my mother said quickly. Together. The vaguest promise in the language. I pressed further. Whose name would be on the disclosures? Silence. Not confusion, not surprise. Calculation. "That's something we can discuss," my sister said carefully. I leaned back in my chair, heart steady, mind clear. Because here's the thing they didn't understand. When you grow up without a safety net, you learn to read silence. You learn that what people don't say often carries more weight than what they do. And in that silence, I heard the truth. They weren't protecting me. They were positioning me. I left the meeting early, no drama, no confrontation, just a polite excuse and a quiet exit. On the drive home, I didn't feel shaken. I felt resolved. When I walked into the apartment, Aaron was sitting in his usual chair, reading glasses perched on his nose, struggling through a manual for something he'd bought secondhand and immediately disassembled. "They confirmed it," I said. He didn't look up. "What you already knew?" "Yes." He nodded. "That's usually how it goes." I sat across from him, suddenly exhausted. They really believe they're entitled to this. He glanced at me then, expression unreadable. People who abandon responsibility early often believe they can reclaim authority later. That sentence stayed with me, because he was right. They hadn't raised me. They hadn't stayed. They hadn't carried any of the weight. But now that I was visible, now that my name meant something, they wanted ownership. Not of me, of what I represented. And that was the moment I stopped trying to understand them. Understanding implies ambiguity. There was none left. From that point on, I wasn't their daughter trying to reconnect. I was a witness. And witnesses don't interrupt. They let people talk. They let them explain themselves. They let them build the case, word by word, until the truth no longer needs interpretation, only exposure. Once I stopped trying to understand my family, everything became easier. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask questions that signaled doubt. I nodded. I agreed. I thanked them for including me. I told them I trusted their judgment. That last part was my favorite. Trust is intoxicating to people who don't deserve it. It makes them careless, generous with words, sloppy with details. They took my compliance as surrender. My father started forwarding the emails without cleaning them up first. My sister spoke more freely in meetings, assuming I shared her priorities now. My mother began using phrases like, "when this is behind us," and "once we're secure again," as if the outcome were already guaranteed. I didn't correct her. I documented. I kept my notes simple. Dates, names, direct quotes. No commentary, no emotional language, just facts arranged in the order they happened. I saved voicemails. I archived texts. I asked for confirmations in writing and framed them as clarity, not caution. They gave me everything I needed. At one point, my sister joked that I was too organized to be dangerous. I laughed and told her that was what medical training did to you. Inside, I thought about how often people mistake discipline for docility. Aaron noticed the change in me before anyone else. "You're calmer," he said one evening as I sorted files at the table. "I'm focused," I replied. "That's worse," he said, "for them." He was right. When people believe you're emotionally invested, they prepare for resistance. When they believe you're agreeable, they stop guarding themselves. They start explaining their reasoning, justifying choices, revealing priorities. During one call, my father laid out the endgame more clearly than he ever had. "Once this stabilizes," he said, "your role can be reduced. You won't need to be involved long term." Reduced, as if my presence were a temporary inconvenience. "And if it doesn't stabilize?" I asked. "Well," he said, "that's unlikely." That wasn't an answer. I asked him to clarify what safeguards were in place if public scrutiny increased. He replied with something vague about legal teams and contingency funds. When I pressed, he grew irritated. "You're overthinking this," he said. "We've been doing this a long time." That was true. They had been doing this a long time, just not successfully. The final piece fell into place when one of their advisors called me directly. Not to discuss strategy, but to test boundaries. "If questions arise," he said carefully, "it would be helpful if you could speak confidently about the intent behind certain decisions." "Whose intent?" I asked. There was a pause. The groups, he replied. And if my understanding differs from theirs? I asked. Another pause, longer this time. We'd want to align narratives, he said. Narratives, not facts. That call ended politely. I saved it immediately. At home, Aaron listened as I recounted the conversation. He shook his head slowly. They don't even realize they're saying it out loud anymore, he said. They think I'm on their side, I replied. He smiled faintly. They think you don't have one. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was no longer confusing. Confusion drains you. Clarity sharpens you. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was prepared. The meeting where everything would come together was scheduled for the following week. A family review, they called it. Legal representation present. Final decisions to be made. My name officially attached. They expected gratitude. What they didn't expect was for me to arrive with my own folder. As the date approached, my mother called more frequently. She reminded me how far we'd come, how proud she was of the way I'd handled everything. You've always been so composed, she said. So reasonable. I smiled into the phone. If you were in my place at that moment, knowing what I knew, would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have stayed long enough to make sure the truth was undeniable? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Because walking away would have been easier. But easier isn't always right. The night before the meeting, Aaron sat across from me at the table, nursing a cup of tea he didn't like, but drank anyway because the doctor told him to. You don't have to do this, he said gently. I know, I replied. You could just leave. I could, I agreed. But then they'd do it to someone else. He studied my face for a long moment. They taught you nothing, he said finally. And you still turned out like this. I laughed quietly. Don't worry, I didn't learn it from them. In the morning, I dressed simply. No power suit, no statement jewelry. Just myself. Calm, precise, unremarkable. The kind of presence people underestimate. As I gathered my folder, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't nervous. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. And corrections don't require anger. They require accuracy. By the time I walked into that room, my family thought they were finalizing a victory. They had no idea they were about to explain, clearly, publicly, and in their own words, exactly who they were. And once that happens, there's no rewriting the record. The room was exactly what they'd chosen it to be. Neutral, professional. Expensive in a way meant to quiet people. Dark wood table, leather chairs, water bottles placed with geometric precision. 2 attorneys on their side, 1 on mine, sitting quietly, unreadable, as if he were attending a meeting about someone else's life. My parents arrived confident, not relaxed, confident. That subtle difference matters. Relaxed people are open to surprise. Confident people believe the outcome has already been decided. My mother smiled when she saw me. My father nodded, already shuffling papers. My sister checked her phone and rolled her shoulders like she was about to give a presentation she'd rehearsed too many times. They assumed I was here to be finalized. I let them. The meeting began the way they wanted it to. Polite introductions, legal language, a summary of what we were aligning on. My name appeared on the screen several times, bolded, centered, framed as reassurance. When they finished, my father turned to me. Any questions? He asked, already halfway to relief. Yes, I said. That single word changed the temperature in the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't even look at my parents at first. I looked at the attorney across the table. Before I agree to anything, I said calmly. I'd like clarification on a few inconsistencies. Inconsistencies? My sister echoed, smiling too quickly. I opened my folder. The sound of paper sliding across a polished table is deceptively loud. I started with timelines, not opinions, timelines. Dates that didn't match, statements that contradicted each other. Funding that was described as secured in one document and speculative in another. My father leaned back, arms crossed. These are minor discrepancies. Then they'll be easy to explain, I replied. Silence. I moved on to authority. Who signed what? Who was accountable if scrutiny increased? I quoted their own emails. Word for word. No interpretation, just repetition. The attorney on their side stopped nodding. My sister interrupted. This feels unnecessary. Only if the answers are clear, I said. They weren't. I didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. I didn't have to. I asked them to explain their own language, their own plans, their own contingency strategies. At one point, my mother said, "You're making this sound much worse than it is." I looked at her then, really looked. "I'm not making it sound like anything," I said. "I'm asking you to describe it." That was the moment their confidence fractured, because description requires ownership. They began to backtrack, to soften phrasing, to reframe intent. The story they'd rehearsed started slipping, replaced by explanations that didn't align with what they'd already committed to writing. The attorney cleared his throat. "I think we should pause," he said carefully. I nodded. "I agree." Then I did something they hadn't prepared for. I closed my folder. "I'm not participating," I said. The words landed cleanly. Final. My father stiffened. "You can't just—" "I can," I replied. "And I am." My sister laughed, sharp and humorless. "You're overreacting." "Possibly," I said. "But I'm also walking away with my name intact. That seems like a fair trade." My mother reached for sentiment. "We're family," she said softly. "This doesn't have to be so adversarial." I smiled, not unkindly, just tired. "It only feels adversarial when someone stops cooperating," I said. "You weren't concerned about harmony when you assumed I'd say yes." The room went quiet. Not dramatic quiet, the uncomfortable kind. The kind where everyone realizes the power dynamic has shifted, but no one wants to say it out loud. Finally, the attorney spoke again. "For the record," he said, "Dr. has raised valid concerns." That was it. Not condemnation, not vindication, confirmation. They didn't explode. They didn't confess. Real life doesn't work that way. They adjusted, retreated, reframed. But the damage was done. They had explained themselves, fully, clearly, on record. And they had done it under the assumption that I was still seeking approval. When the meeting ended, my father pulled me aside. "You didn't have to embarrass us," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "I didn't. You did that yourselves." I left without another word. Outside, the air felt lighter. Not triumphant, just clean. When I got home, Aaron was sitting at the table, reading the same page of a book he'd been pretending to finish for weeks. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I walked away," I said. He nodded. "Good." "No shouting," I added. "No scenes." He smiled faintly. "Disappointing. I was hoping for a dramatic exit." I laughed. The sound surprised me. "They finally know," I said. "Know what?" "That I'm not available." Aaron closed his book. "That's the most dangerous thing a person can be," he said. "Unavailable." I slept deeply that night, not because everything was resolved, but because it was finished. They had tried to reclaim authority they'd forfeited years ago. They had failed. And for the first time since they came back into my life, I didn't feel watched. I felt free. All that remained was deciding what stayed with me, and what I was finally willing to leave behind. Cutting ties didn't happen all at once. People like to imagine it as a single decisive moment, a slammed door, a final speech, a clean break. In reality, it was quieter than that, more administrative, less cinematic. There were follow-up emails from attorneys, carefully worded messages from my parents that sounded conciliatory, but asked for clarification. My sister tried humor, then guilt, then irritation, as if cycling through emotions might unlock a response I'd forgotten to send. I replied to none of it. Silence, when chosen intentionally, is not avoidance, it's resolution. A few weeks later, I heard through professional channels that the project had stalled. Funding dried up. Advisors withdrew. Without my name attached, the structure they'd built collapsed under its own weight. No scandal, no headlines, just a quiet failure, exactly the kind that doesn't offer anyone a villain to blame. I suspected they blamed me anyway. That too was fine. Aaron noticed the change in me before I articulated it myself. "You're lighter," he said one morning as I packed groceries into the fridge. "I stopped carrying things that weren't mine," I replied. He considered that. "About time. Your posture was getting terrible." That was his way of saying he was proud. Life settled into a new rhythm, not dramatically different, just cleaner. Fewer interruptions, fewer emotional calculations. I focused on my work, on my patients, on the small, unglamorous routines that had always anchored me. Aaron's health declined slowly, predictably, the way bodies do when they've been asked to work harder than they should for too long. This time, he didn't resist help. He accepted it the way he'd given it, without commentary. I moved back in, not because I had to, because I wanted to. We argued about stupid things, thermostat settings, whether socks could be considered optional indoors. He insisted on folding laundry his way, which involved more creases than physics should allow. I let him, because dignity matters. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch him watching me with an expression I didn't quite recognize. "What?" I asked once. He shrugged. "Just checking." "For what?" "That you're still here." I smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to pretending he wasn't tired. My parents tried one last time. A letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, apologetic in tone, vague in substance. They spoke about misunderstandings, about family bonds, about how painful it was to feel shut out. They never mentioned the documents, the meetings, the expectations. They never mentioned Aaron. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not as a reminder, as a record. Some things don't need responses. They need boundaries. Months later, at a small gathering with colleagues, someone asked if my family was proud of my work. It was an innocent question, asked without context. I answered honestly. "The people who raised me are," I said. That was enough. Aaron passed away quietly one morning, the way he'd lived, without fanfare. I was there, holding his hand, telling him things he already knew but deserved to hear anyway. Afterward, standing alone in the apartment that had never felt temporary, I thought about the girl I'd been at 14. The one who'd stood in a kitchen holding a duffel bag, trying to understand why love could disappear so easily. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't promise success, or vindication, or justice. I'd tell her this: some people will leave you because they can. Some will return because they think you'll let them. And a very few will stay, not because you're useful, or impressive, or easy, but because they've decided you matter. Choose those people, every time. That choice won't always be loud, or celebrated, or understood, but it will be yours. And that, I learned, is the only kind of ending that actually lasts. Looking back now, I don't think the hardest part was being left behind. The hardest part was learning that being wanted isn't the same as being valued. Some people only remember you when your name opens doors. Some families only recognize you when you become useful. And some lessons don't arrive as pain. They arrive as clarity, long after the damage could have been repeated. I didn't win by exposing anyone publicly. I didn't need revenge. I won the moment I stopped negotiating my worth with people who had already spent it once before. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, used, or quietly erased, then you already understand why walking away can be the bravest decision someone makes. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, quiet strength, and choosing yourself without apology, make sure you subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't about fantasy or drama. They're about real choices, real consequences, and the kind of courage that doesn't shout. Subscribe, stay with us, and keep listening. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear again.